welcome to the Hudson Institute. It's my pleasure to have you with us for this important discussion, and it's my honor to welcome three distinguished guests to discuss the one-year anniversary of the Abraham Accords, the Accords' potential, its future, and what's been going on in the last year so far. Malcolm Hoenlein is the vice chair of the Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations, an organization he's helped lead for several decades, 3-4 decades. And it was part of his tenure, he pioneered the American Jewish community's relations with leaders in the Arab world, and has been an advisor and an interlocutor and a cherished confidant of many policymakers and elected officials here in the United States of both parties, as well as leaders in Israel. So we're really pleased to have you, Malcolm. Thank you for joining us. Mohammed Baharoon is the co-founder and director general of BAHIA, the Dubai Public Policy Research Institute, where he leads strategic insights into long-term thinking, future-proofing, strategic relations, diplomatic relations and security affairs, geopolitically in the region and beyond. He's just a wonderful guy, and he probably knows where to get some great Texas barbecue since he got his master's degree down at Texas Tech. Ariel Kahana is with us. Ariel is one of Israel's most distinguished journalists. He is the senior diplomatic correspondent for Israel Hayom, Israel's largest and most widely circulated newspaper. He's also worked for Ma'ariv and Makor Rishon. And Ariel has, because of his job, has traveled with and travels with the prime ministers of Israel, and has been part of the delegations, the historic delegations to several of the Abraham Accord countries and some others that are not necessarily yet part of the Accords and may not have public ties with Israel. He's also written a couple of investigative pieces on the Accords themselves, how they come about, what's the background, and why choose the Accords over extending sovereignty and annexation. And in addition, he's recently been with Prime Minister Bennett on his trip to the United States. And as I understand it, Ariel, the Prime Minister of Israel is currently meeting with the President of Egypt, Mr. Sisi. And should we get an update from that meeting, I guess you'll let us know. Is that right?
That's my job.
All right. Well, it's fitting that the leader of Israel is in a meeting with another head of state from an Arab country, a neighbor, because one of the things that happened in the last year is that Israel's peace dividend, if you will, or relationships expanded 300 times. You know, Israel was at peace, found itself at peace with 2 countries in the region a little over a year ago, and now 6, 7, 8, and growing. So the opportunities for deepening relationships and expanding the ties in the region are truly there. And I think our opportunity today is to hear from our guests about what they sense players here in the United States, in Israel, and in the UAE, in the Arab world, see. What do they see? What value do they see in these accords? Why is it important to pursue and to carry forward? And, you know, given some of the recent events that have taken place in the region, you know, whether it's America's withdrawal from Afghanistan and the attendant potential consequences of that, which we're still reckoning with, and the larger question of America's presence in the region as it shifts some attention to Asia, as well as China's interest in the region and its need for a consistent supply of oil for its country and its economy, looking to dig in deeper to the region and perhaps create different kinds of relationships than have been before. So all these things are happening at a time when Israel and its relationships with these Arab states are burgeoning. Mohammed, why don't you start us off with, you know, a scene setter? What is it that brought the UAE and Bahrain and others to a place where the relationship with Israel, which had been going on, you know, for some time privately, was now ready for prime time, so to speak?
Good morning and good afternoon to all of you. I think the answer is by now quite obvious. The UAE have looked at the region, looked at the source of most of the conflicts, realized that those conflicts are conflicts of identity, and needed to deconflict that type of conflict. And around it, we've had a number of countries, groups, ideologies built around this concept of hating the others. So what started as a conflict between the Palestinians and the Israelis became a conflict between Arabs and Zionists, and then became a conflict between Muslims and Jews. So the circle of conflict of identity kept growing. And everything that has happened in the last 60 years, it didn't seem to be going somewhere. So the UAE calculus was that without taking out that enemy from the equation and turn it into someone I can sit down with on a table, have a discussion, try and figure out how we can move things around, it's going to be difficult to achieve anything. So hence was the Abrahamic Accord. But also the Abrahamic Accord was regional in its outlook. It was not a bilateral relationship only. The bilateral relationship is very important, but that's the tree that makes the forest. It's not the forest.
Excellent. Well, I know, I know what sense of excitement there was here in the United States among just everyday folks. I was privileged to be able to attend the signing ceremony on the White House lawn. Malcolm, you were there as well. You were slightly in front of me. Your seat was a little bit farther forward than mine. Tell us about the atmosphere that day at the White House. What were people saying to each other? How did people feel about what was taking place?
Well, it was a very celebratory event, as you know, and it was unique in the sense that people had real confidence that this was going to be different than previous agreements in that they would be a piece of the people, which the UAE demonstrated most demonstratively, and that it wouldn't be simply a piece of paper signed by leaders of the governments, but not filtered down. And we see it reflected in the numbers that have come out just in the last days, how trade has increased so dramatically. I think it's up 250% over the equivalent of last year amongst the countries in the Abraham Accords. And that's only the beginning and limited by COVID. So the potential is much greater. I was in Morocco recently, and when you see the planes landing and you know that Royal Moroccan and UAE aircraft are flying back and forth and Israeli planes through the region, things that were unthinkable. When we started 25 years ago, reaching out and going to Qatar, going to other countries, it was, people were very skeptical, even mocking at times about the potential. But the truth is, we realized that outside powers have their own interests, and they often diverge from the interests of the parties who have to face each other across borders, even if there are bodies of border, but today they are very limited. And the fact is that the potential cooperation, and once the realization that Israel is not the source of instability, but stability in the region, that it was a reliable ally, that they have so much to share. And I've heard this from every leader of the Abraham Accord and countries beyond the Abraham Accords who hope one day to join, that they recognize they have a lot to gain from Israel. Israel's not a huge country, but its accomplishments in high tech and so many other areas, and the cooperation. When we started the Mediterranean Initiative with Greece, Israel, Cyprus, the vision was to incorporate these other areas. And I have to say it was President Sisi who first said to me, I will bring the Gulf into this. And that was years ago. And he understood that it could be one region of stability, that you take these countries out of the volatility of the Middle East and put them in the Mediterranean basin, connected to the Gulf and even beyond. We can help stabilize the region, deal together on every area, security, high-tech, biotech, water tech, so many areas where they have common interests, common needs, and especially now with the energy flow in the region. So I thought that the experience at the White House, I was at all the signings over the years. This was, I think, the most exciting in many respects because they saw the potential. They saw that this was only the beginning. And I hope, and I believe that the Biden administration has not abandoned it. They may not like the Abraham Accord term, as you rightly pointed out, but normalization is okay too, if it's really exercised and America uses its leverage, and the things that it can deliver can be key to the success of the future movement towards a greater peaceful region.
Good news, Malcolm. The State Department has added a page called the Abraham Accords to its website. Right. So the administration is embracing the term finally.
Exactly.
But your point is not lost, which is to say, one of the things about the Abraham Accords that strikes me as so powerful is that it really, no pun intended, it empowers the parties. And this agreement and its depth and its strength and its potential is not fulfilled by the United States. It's fulfilled by the players in the region. And so it's unique in a way in that it doesn't necessarily have to be held captive to the vagaries of American policy or the hostility of European policy or anyone else for that matter. It seems to me to be up to the players to bring themselves together. Ariel, does the Bennett administration, the Bennett-Lapid administration, see the Abraham Accords or expanding regional diplomatic ties like this as a priority, particularly when the Palestinian negotiations may not be moving as quickly?
Hi, Josh, and thanks for having me. So the answer is definitely yes. I can tell you that just after the Jewish holidays, we now have, there's going to be a trip, I would say third trip by Yair Lapid, foreign minister, to Bahrain. And that after he was in Morocco about a month ago, and before that in the UAE, in 3 countries, he opened and will open the Israeli embassies or official delegations when it comes to Morocco. So no doubt Bennett and Lapid, and actually it's a consensus here in Israel, everybody wants this peace. You know, we had 200,000 tourists, Israelis who went to visit the UAE and it was a COVID year just in the last year. So the numbers are unbelievable, and Malcolm brought some of them. So again, this peace, not like other agreements we had in the past, is a consensus. Everybody supported, everybody, right and left, are happy with it and do want to go with it forward, and including this government. Now, you may come and ask, can this government do it? And in this point, I think because the altitude of the new government in Israel is different, and they do want to deal in one way or another with the Palestinian issue, therefore, I am not sure they will be able to push forward this process. Because in my view, one of the things that made the possibility of the Abraham Accord, maybe we'll go to that afterwards a little bit deeper, but the fact that no Israel or the Arab states that were part of the process, there was kind of, let's say, agreement not to deal this time with the Palestinian issue, but go to the interest of both sides, that gave the opportunity to push this process forward. Once you're going to deal with the Palestinian issue, which we all know you have no solution for that, not in Gaza and not in Judea and Samaria, not in the territories. So once you deal with a problem that you have no solution for, that might stop the problem, stop the process. And from this aspect, I'm not sure it's that positive. But the government is trying to go forward with it, no doubt about that.
One thing that I was struck by that, Malcolm, you raised, and I know, Mohammed, we've touched on in the past, is how much Israel has to offer in terms of its knowledge and experience, and from drip irrigation to silicon and chips and AI and all these things. Now, Mohammed, one of the things I think that the accords are intended to help the UAE and others do is develop some indigenous corporate and infrastructure. And one of the things I think that people have talked about is the importance of partnership, and sometimes that partnership comes along with knowledge transfer. For many years, the United States has had a lot of export controls on a number of things, some sensitive and some nonsensical. But nonetheless, sometimes those relationships become complicated by export control rules. Sometimes when that happens, it opens the door to other parties, like say China, who is far more willing to engage in very cheap technology sharing and offering things in order to get in. But there are often strings attached to those things, then it's not always the best way to go, and there are other people available. It seems to me that Israel may be emerging as an important partner for the UAE and others in some of these key areas, and that might lessen people's dependence on China, perhaps, or some of these other things. How does that look to you?
Well, Josh, first of all, I think this type of knowledge sharing or knowledge transfer is becoming very important, because most of the countries in the Gulf are now have embarked on a transformation of their economy from an oil-based economy, and they've chosen a knowledge-based economy. And that applies to, be it the UAE, Saudi Arabia with its Vision 2030, Qatar, Bahrain, all of those countries have started to do this. Now, this means that there is a new type of requirement that would change the nature of the relationship that they've had with either the US or Europe. And that requires that there is some sort of a growth in their palates. What used to be good for them in the past is not enough for them today. And part of that is that they want to develop indigenous capabilities. China, opened up. Others Korea has opened up. But that is not because it's cheap. It's based on a respect that I can trust you with the technology, which usually does not come with the US or with Europe, who have those exports mainly because they cannot trust this region with the technology. So that is one of those issues. Now, Israel has offered that type of respect. And I think that respect has been reciprocated. And I think that's a major issue. But is Israel, when it comes, let's say, to the UAE, better than South Korea? Maybe not when it comes to a high-tech industry. But what we have here is something that can be organic to the region, can have an impact on the region. It's not going to be only between the UAE, and if there is a line that moves all the way from UAE, let's say, to Israel, a train or whatever, along that line, there's going to be a lot of industries built up, a lot of development. So that type of an approach we have is let's grow the entire region, because we see that the role of the whole region, this Arabian Peninsula, is a very important connection between Asia, Africa, and Europe. And Israel is smack on at that, Mediterranean end of the Arabian Peninsula.
Malcolm, you've been engaged in these conversations at a high level for a long time. What is it do you think that the leaders in the Arab world need and want, and what is it that Israel can give, and what does Israel want that the Arab leaders can provide? How does this? What's the mutual interest here?
First of all, I think it's a serious catalog of mutual interests and potential interests that really lie in the future for the Accord and for the region. But first of all, by countries that have this intra-dependency as opposed to the being dependent on outside powers who have a different array of interests and who tend to exploit regions. I think the United States is the most selfless country in this regard, but the recognition that not only is it a local call between the countries in terms of delivery, but the ability to cooperate, to increase tourism, to exchanges, cultural, in many realms beyond business and beyond security implications, which I think are very great. All the countries face challenges from outside powers, and I consider Iran an outside power, though it's in the region, and it's a common threat to all of the countries. It seeks to destabilize all of the regimes. Turkey has also played a destabilizing role, although now we see the outreach taking place with Egypt, with UAE, with others. Whether that reflects a real sea change, we will have to see. But China's interests are in exploiting energy. I mean, they want to take out, not to put into the region. They've invested a lot in Israel. They are investing now in other parts of the region. And the region today is not just the countries on the periphery of the Mediterranean or the Gulf. We've expressed, the interest has been expressed by the countries of Central Asia. And as Mohammed pointed out, when you start having the ability to communicate between countries, if you have a new Oriental Express, if you have other kinds of means of transportation, of binding people across borders, I can't tell you how many countries have expressed interest or told us that they want to be part of this. And it goes from the Atlantic all the way to the Indian Ocean. Think of what that would mean if you can stabilize that region. It will limit the ability of outside parties to exploit it. I mean, Russia is present in a lot of the countries in Syria. Even the Tsars didn't achieve it. The Ottoman Empire didn't achieve, and the Persians didn't achieve getting the footholds that they have so far away from their homeland. So the countries of the region are the ones who have to face these challenges. And while it's different for each country to a degree, in fact, a stable region benefits all of them. And we've already seen it not only in the trade and the tourism that's taken place, but this is an insurance policy for them. They know that Israel can't leave. Israel is a permanent aircraft carrier. It can't be taken to Southeast Asia or any place else. It's there, it's got to stay there, it's got to fight there, it's got to protect not only itself, because it knows that if Egypt is unstable, if Jordan is unstable, if the UAE is unstable, Israel will be unstable. I had a meeting with some government officials, and after an hour, they said, you've spoken to us, we've been talking for an hour, we never mentioned Israel. I said, that's exactly the point, that the stability of all these countries is Israel's stability as well. And Israel's stability is critical to all of them. because today that is a capacity that is essential in fighting terrorism, in the negatives and in the positives, in terms of countering some of the threats, but also in developing some of the potential that exists. So I think this intradependency in the region is a positive. It can lead to amazing developments. I know that Saudi Arabia is developing and dreams of the new city, and there, think of what Israel can offer in terms of technology to it, what from Aqaba to Eilat to Sharm el-Sheikh to Naim, you could have just boat cruises going on. So that alone would be a reason enough to do it. But there is unlimited potential. And I especially saw it in my visits with the UAE, where the understanding, and they really broke the ice on having public demonstrations of this instead of always doing it in a clandestine way.
Yeah, the leadership of the Emirates is to be historically applauded, no question about it, and Bahrain as well. Ariel, when you were not to imply you're an older guy here, but when you were 18 and getting ready to go and to do your military service, which was not just yesterday, some years ago, did you ever imagine that this was the kind of conversation we'd be having?
Definitely not, Josh. Definitely not. And you know what? I don't want to go back to my many years ago when I was a soldier. I want to take you back just 1.5 years ago, maybe even less, because I had the privilege to cover the first flight from Ben Gurion here in Israel to Abu Dhabi. It was unbelievable. It was unbelievable. We land, and then you see the flags of Israel and the UAE publicly shown, of course, in the airport. And then you see our national security advisor, Meir Ben Shabbat, gives his speech with his kippah on his head in Arabic, and of course, bless the kingdom and so on. You couldn't believe what you saw. But even more important, comparing it to other peace accords Israel had, in this case, and I think all my colleagues here mentioned it, it was also between the people. And me, as an Israeli journalist, I could feel it, because that evening, the first day we were in Abu Dhabi, we were taken to the Louvre, that series over there, and then to a dinner, and we could talk to people, we could talk to colleagues, UAE colleagues from the media over there, and it was, the atmosphere was warm. We were welcomed as Israelis, as Jews. We were welcomed, and you could feel it. And they told us we want to come, and they asked me questions about our culture and about our history. You could feel it comes from the ground, and the people wants it. And I also want to mention, it's very important for me to say that I felt that I can learn from my new friends in the Emirates. Just one example. Both countries are kind of combination between old traditions, old religions, and high tech we just mentioned, and technology and so on. And how do you combine with Western values with your traditional values? Just one aspect. Usually people don't talk about it, and there are many others as well. Of course, business, tourism, as we mentioned. So I take very, actually, I would say in my career, not as a soldier, but as a journalist, 25 years now, no doubt that the visits in the UAE, before that in Bahrain, then in Morocco, it was a highlight. No doubt it was a highlight, and I will have it with me for years. Now, if I may, just one quick point about China and the region you mentioned. Look, the American withdrawal from Afghanistan, which is definitely understood, but that no doubt made a negative momentum here in the region, because now you have, I'm sorry, Josh, you have, and I tell you why, you have a black bloc from Afghanistan to Iran, to Iraq, to Syria, to Lebanon, to the Gaza Strip, and of course to Yemen, and China, you mentioned, backs it from far away, but still they give them money. And that takes our region to a negative momentum. And I think if there is anything that might stop the process of the Abraham Accords, is this one. Because the countries came out together because of strengths, Israeli strengths, UAE strengths, and of course, American strengths. Once the perceptions is that the countries, the governments are weak, that no one stops evil, that no one stops terrorism, and so on, no one stops extreme Islam. That's our common problem, extreme Islam. Once no one stops it, then the question is, okay, how can we cooperate? And therefore, I know it doesn't look realistic for now, but I do hope that, after the US will overcome what happened in Afghanistan, there will be energy, there will be motivation to deal with Iran, because that is our common problem, not only here in the Middle East, but also for the Western world, including the US. One day they will come after the US. I want to remind you, we talk about our region, but Iran tried to assassinate the Saudi ambassador in Washington. It happened. So we have to remember that deep inside, Iran is our common problem. And I do hope again that all of us, Israel, the UAE, other Arab countries, and of course America, we could all cooperate together to deal with Iran the way it should be dealt. That will also bring positive momentum to the peace process here in the region.
One of the things I'm concerned about is the pending American withdrawal from Iraq, which has not been discussed much, but has still, as I know, been planned and not been called off. And Mohammed, I wonder your thoughts there. If American forces were to withdraw from that country, and Iraq actually is a functioning democracy, unlike Afghanistan in some ways, and the US were to leave, doesn't that create an immense power vacuum that Iran would fill? Am I wrong, or what do you see happening? Is that should the US pause and recalibrate that choice of withdrawal?
Josh, I can't be in a position where I suggest what the US can do or won't do.
I'll do that, Mohammed. I'll do that.
You can do that on my behalf. But what I mean, from an analytical point of view, you're right. There is going to be, a vacuum. The vacuum has been there for a while. It has been created, and I have to say, has been filled not by the US. The US helped fill it. I mean, during the war on Daesh, the US have encouraged coordinated roles with the Hashd al-Shabi, the Popular Mobilization Forces, because they needed soldiers on the ground.
We're saying that, just so that for the uninitiated, you're saying that the Obama administration directly coordinated and worked on the ground with the Iranian-backed forces. Okay. Just want to make sure people understand.
That is history. I'm not revealing a secret.
Yeah, we're not making it up.
They share bunkers, they share communication. And the overall objective was that we have a common enemy, which is ISIS, and we need all to, And even though the logic seems at that point of time possibly accepted, but it gave Iran a security role in the region, and that was after signing the deal. It was no surprise that the Popular Mobilization Forces emerged after the deal, after JCPOA. The Houthis also resurged after that. We've seen Iran moving Zainabiyun and Fatimiyun from Afghanistan and Pakistan to fight in Syria. So there was a new role for Iran to fill that void. Now, to think that US strategists don't see that, I think is a wrong assumption. The right assumption is that they realize, but maybe they're okay. Maybe they're okay with that. They believe that Iraq can continue maintaining some sort of a balance. Maybe the engagement of Saudi Arabia with Iran, with Iraq, would provide some sort of a countering balance. But there are a lot of maybes there.
I think, honestly, Mohammed, it's worse than that. I think there are people in the top echelons of policymaking at the Pentagon who believe that Iran is a better ally for the United States than Israel or Arab states. And so they're quite willing to see Iran expand its role in the region, just as they wanted to replace the instability of Assad and ISIS with Iran, believe it or not. I mean, it sounds crazy here, considering Iran's leading state sponsor of terrorism, and Hezbollah, its terrorist army, has killed more Americans than anybody but Al-Qaeda. What did you make this week when the United States approved the shipment of oil from Iran to Lebanon? There are many countries in the region that could supply oil to Lebanon. Why do you think the United States approved the shipment from Iran?
Ask the United States. But then I would say, Josh, I wouldn't go as far as saying that they wanted Iran to take. I think what the US is looking at is that this is a high price, but an acceptable price.
Malcolm, what is your take on the thinking of the administration here?
As you know, for more than 20 years, I've been trying to talk to administrations about the problem of Iran. So it's not a problem of today. And I agree with both of the speakers. Iran is the central issue. It's not the only issue, but it's a central issue. And it's related to all the other threats, the threats of extremism, terrorism. Without you remove Iran, you've solved many of the problems of the region, or at least paved the way for solutions, I think, in the region. And that's why the Abraham Accords have to be based on positives, not negatives, that if you remove the negative, there would be no more reason. It is based on positive needs. I just want to say, you know, around the world, we've seen double-digit increases in anti-Semitism in the United States and Europe, elsewhere. You know, the one region that's an exception is the Abraham Accord countries. Look what the UAE, Saudi Arabia, even Egypt, Morocco have done to change textbooks, to educate the people. You see the support of 60% in many of the countries for the Abraham Accords and for better relations. When for many years, you know, the polls all showed negative attitudes. It showed what governments can do to help change and turn things and make it a piece of the people and change the region, which is essential, because if you don't acclimate the next generation to wanting peace, to living with people, having them at each other's universities. I know Morocco, UAE, others are all already establishing joint programs with Israeli universities. That's critical. Exchange programs, all the things that expose them to each other, so you break down the barriers, because it can't be just mobilizing against. We have to mobilize all our resources against Iran. Iran is moving ahead every day, and unfortunately there are countries in the region that partner with it, that believe that they can somehow tame this tiger. You cannot, because their goal is hegemony. They do not want to recognize anyone else, and even other Muslims, and even other Shiites that they contend with. So Iran is driven by an extremist ideology that is uncompromising. And the new leadership, nobody was a moderate before, but these guys are even more when you have a Raisi heading a government. So I look at the talks in Vienna where they're dancing because Grassi supposedly reached an agreement to allow for the cameras to be checked every few months or refitted to put in equipment. But the fact is that they can't control it and they can't access, and they still don't get the ability to visit undeclared sites. And in the meantime, they're stockpiling the enriched uranium. They're increasing the percentages. They're putting in new IR6 centrifuge cascades. All of this is moving ahead. So the imperative right now is for the countries of the region to stand to get the powers to be, because Russia's interest is not in Iran. And Russia was the last, if you remember, after World War II, they stayed in Iran, and there's a lot of residual dislike for them. I think it's critical that America stays in Syria. It's just a presence. It's not, we have no big investment there. You know, Putin very cleverly took over in Syria with two squadrons of aircraft, or with very minimal investments. It's not a question of how many you have there, but in the Middle East, perception is more important than reality, or it is the reality. And it's how they perceive America's commitment, which means the presence of the troops, the presence of our aircraft carriers, other things, is the basis on which Arab leaders and others have to make their determinations. They can't find out what's in the hearts of people. They can see what's happening on the ground. And it's critical to the Kurds, to others who are allies, people who are oriented towards the West, a country like Morocco, that we should be supporting all of these guys, these countries, in direct ways and indirect ways. There are political standing up for them, and as well as having a capable and quantifiable military presence on which they think they can rely if the occasion comes up. Most countries do not need Americans to fight for them. We need America to support them. They need American assistance. They need to buy equipment to it. We need to be able to supply UAE with aircraft. Otherwise, they do like Egypt, turn to Russia for it. That is not in America's interest, to see Russia again becoming the supplier of aircraft, fighter aircraft and stuff to countries in the region. So I believe it's a really critical for us to look at the region as a whole, to look at what are the threats and how the countries themselves can be strengthened, working together, because part of that is a reaction to the mistrust of the outside powers.
Ariel, on Prime Minister Bennett's recent trip to Washington, which was delayed, his meeting with President Biden was delayed by a day by a terrorist attack in Afghanistan that killed some 14 American troops and a couple hundred others. And watching the events transpire in Afghanistan couldn't have given anyone a sense of confidence or pride. As people in Israel were watching those scenes, and then watching the president give his remarks after, in which he seemed to emphasize his reluctance to use military force, I wonder whether leaders there are internalizing the question of what options Israel may have with regard to a bomb in Iran. I saw that just this morning, I believe, was published an extensive interview that you conducted with Ron Dermer, who is the past Israeli ambassador to Washington, in which he made some very pointed remarks. I don't think that they're shocking to anyone, but he said very clearly that, yes, he believed that President Obama wanted to stop or prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. He believes that President Biden also shares that ambition, but simply looking at the facts of reality at the moment, he sees that the Iranians have already amassed enough 60% enriched material, which one could use as a weapon, but can be up enriched to 90% with one cascade of centrifuges in a matter of a few weeks, all of which could have happened or be happening right now with the cameras that we can't see that Malcolm was mentioning. And of course, those cameras just distract from the other 24 sites, and I've written a policy document on this. You can get a look at all of the sites that the Iranians are stonewalling and the priorities and what's there if you go to the Hudson website. But they're stonewalling all these things. So Ariel, when people look at that, it must give a certain sense of urgency there. The talks, as Malcolm mentioned, are kind of delayed. They're pushing them along. Between September and November, critical things could happen. Between June and now, critical things could have happened. What are Israeli leaders thinking about this situation in terms of how Israel needs to act to defend itself by itself, if in fact it is universally believed that if left to its own momentum without Israel's intervention militarily, perhaps, Iran would end up as a nuclear power?
Well, maybe it's the question we have these days. Look, what Ambassador Dermer said, and I want to bring the full quote. He said that just as the US didn't want Pakistan and North Korea to have nuclear bomb, and then in the end, those countries we all know do have, the same process will happen or might happen with Iran if the US will not act. And the way you see it, as the US is not going to act, because as you said, Obama, Biden, Trump, all of them, even Bush. No one wanted Iran to have a bomb, but they didn't do the needed actions that has to be taken to stop Iran. That's the bottom line, as it's seen from here, from Israel. Now, of course, Israel prefers that, let's say, the US will do the job. But if Israel will feel that it is pushed to the wall, that the knife is on our neck, I think it is a consensus that we will have to act. We do not want the Israeli government. No one wants to be at this point, but it seems closer, and I will tell you why. Just it was an on the record statement by Benny Gantz, security defense minister. He said that 5 weeks ago, and 5 weeks ago, Iran was close, quoting, in 10 weeks to a breakout, to have enough materials for won't go into the exact details, but 10 weeks from breakout. That's what he said. And as I said, now 5 weeks already passed. So it seems coming closer and closer. So dragging the time, not coming back to the talks with the US, but from the other hand, not suggesting any other direction. By the way, the US as well is not saying, okay, what is the deadline? What's going to happen if they are not coming back what administration is going to do. We here in Israel, we have no answer about that. You mentioned Bennett's visit. By the way, I was not there with Bennett this time, but as far as I know, he got no clear answers about what America is going to do in case Iran is not coming back to the talks. So and again, if we go back to Afghanistan and the perception, the feeling that the US is not the strongest it can be, combining that to what's going on here now. Again, there is escalation with Hamas in Gaza, another terror attack that took place today, and you have daily events like that. All together brings the tension, I would say, higher. And now, I think people do not want to talk about that, but back in their minds, people understand, yes, we might act. Now, I would add my cent about that, and that is, again, I'm going back to the weakness. If Israel sends a message of weakness, and at the moment, our government is not the strongest one, it includes some anti-Zionist powers, even in some way extreme Muslim powers in Israeli government. In any case, it's a weak government because it has just 61 votes in the Knesset, and even that is not that stable. So I can say that today Israel sends the strongest message it sends as well. It seems to me that all that, America and Israel together, that Iran might see that as an opportunity for her to act or to rush forward. And therefore, and I do know that in our security establishment, people take that scenario as very serious. So all that all together might bring us to a point we'll have to act. What is sure that Israel's policy for years, but by all governments, by all sides, is not to let Iran having a nuclear bomb. And if there will be a breakout by Iran, and if the US won't act, so Israel will do what it can do, including the price we'll have to pay after that, because it's clear that the price will be heavy. But again, Israel won't let other countries, and of course not an enemy like Iran, to have nuclear bomb.
Well, it is a sobering question, and I think we're closer to these decision points than people may realize, because Iran has successfully leveraged Russia. Lavrov this week, or last week, just before the quarterly meeting of the IAEA board, called Grossi and urged him to go to Iran. Now, the reason that will lead to this kind of potential deal you're describing. But the reason that's important is because it's a dilatory tactic on Lavrov's part. You have to send a letter to the Iranians. They have to respond to your letter. You have to then go. So all of this is really just a pantomime. And I think, American officials are aware, and they've said, oh, this doesn't last forever. But I see Israeli officials saying things like our military plans, I think have been tremendously accelerated, or greatly accelerated, I think was the quote from 3 days ago. And, I think, watching American weakness does not give Israelis a sense of comfort. It makes them believe, I believe, that they need to be strong and be willing to act with whomever is around them that is willing to take the steps required to stop the danger. Syria's nuclear reactor reminds me of that. I wonder what that conflict in Syria would have been like if the ISIS rebels or someone else had access to nuclear material. Mohammed, from where you're sitting, do you see the tension with Iran in the region potentially going up? Are you concerned about that? What's your view?
Well, we tend to ask ourselves the difficult questions and sometimes theoretical questions. One theoretical question is that what would it need to get Iran to sign an Abrahamic Accord? It's a hypothetical question, but that's part of the way we try and think about it. Because Iran, end of the day, for us, is a geographic reality, it's a demographic reality, and it's a historical reality. We had connections with Iran, with Iranian people, and it's the same concept that we use with the Abrahamic Accord, which is the Abrahamic faith, which is the commonality between different faiths. is the same concept that we use with the Iranians. If they're Shia or not, if Zoroastrist or not, we're all human beings. If we can agree on a certain way forward with respect to their religion, their respect to ours and being, then maybe we can get somewhere. Now, the structural problem we have with Iran is that we're dealing with Iran as a state when Iran does not behave as a state. It has two heads, so to speak. And that's the problem, structural problem with dealing with Iran. They believe in the transnational, the non-state actors. And that's again a problem. And if you look around, we haven't, as citizens of the world, as countries of the UN, have never agreed on some sort of an accord to say, this is how we behave or deal with non-state actors who hold weapons and use religion as a way of supremacy over others. We don't have any. We have a toolbox that allows us to deal with terrorists, but we don't have a toolbox that allows us to deal with non-state actors, armed non-state actors who operate transnationally. That is a major problem, and it will continue to be with us. And I think that is part of what. But if there was a prize, a major prize for the Abrahamic Accord, it would be a signing accord with Iran. How do we get there? Imaginary as it sounds right now, but maybe not as imaginary as the UAE signing an accord. Is something that needs people like think tanks and others start talking about and figuring out if there is a possibility towards that or not. But again, part of the worry of the region is possibly not the withdrawal of the US from Iraq as much as the withdrawal of the Patriots from Saudi Arabia. Because if you can justify the withdrawal from Iraq as this is jeopardizing human life, American life, in Saudi Arabia, it's not the same. You're withdrawing Patriots and THAADs that are actually being paid by the Saudis. There is no operational, necessity where you're moving it, let's say, from Saudi Arabia to Erbil to stop the drones attacking the airport. That is not happening. It sends an extremely difficult message, and that message would possibly make people think of recalibrating, adapting, and that adaptation might not be the best thing, but that's what people do under pressure.
I heard a rumor that even, Malcolm, have you heard this, that there are some inside the Biden administration who are advocating for recognizing Hezbollah?
No, I've not heard them talking about recognizing Hezbollah, but about having some engagements. But I don't think that that's an immediate option. I think they have a realistic assessment of it. Their concern is the stability of Lebanon and how to break that dependency, as we see, is just increasing. And it's one of the dynamics in the region that I think proves Mohammed's points earlier, that you have a lot of countries that are on the verge. And that's why the West's message to them is so important. And in regard to Iran, I think the really important message is the one we send to the people of Iran, who are engaged every day in demonstrations, 6,000 last year, rising up against this totalitarian regime at great risk to their lives and no resonance in the West. Nobody stands up for them and with them and listens to their cries. They're doing such courageous things. And I believe that's the way you bring about change. And that's the way we could have a stable regime in Iran. And once that's accomplished, there's every reason to believe that Iran could gain greatly and contribute to the larger region. Jews are in there, they have lived there for thousands of years, and most of the time pretty successfully. And true in other places as well. But Iran, in and of itself, as long as we don't stand up against this regime, unless we don't send the messages, when the sanctions were imposed, we saw the impact and how close we could have come to forcing their hand. And now the price of oil goes up, so they get a bit of relief, et cetera. We have to impose more sanctions. The administration has done that lately, but not enough. The currency is at zero. They don't care about the people. 40% of the economy in the hand of the supreme leader in the IRGC. So as long as they get paid off, the people can suffer. Unemployment, 40% amongst young people, even higher. There are great potentials in a country that is unfortunately suffering greatly under COVID. The number of deaths is multiple of what they admit. We are in touch with people in the country. We hear from them. and their desperate call to the West just to be heard, to have demonstrations of solidarity with them, of having their plight be known. And remember, we have an added element, and that's the internet, which countries like Iran and Turkey and others use as a platform for spreading anti-Semitism, for destabilizing the other regimes in the area. They have massive enterprises using the internet to promulgate their hateful messages and to sow divisions and to threaten their neighbors, even if they're sitting and talking with them on the surface, beneath the surface. You go to the dark web, you see how terrible their activities are and how dangerous it is. So I think that it's imperative that, number one, the countries stand together, that we can show the world the positives that can come about. That's an inspiration to the people in the countries who are opposed to their regimes. And I think even amongst the Palestinians, that the potential is there if the circumstances were right, if they had the right kind of leadership that was selfless and really willing to put the interests of their people first. This is a critical time. I mean, the decisions made now may last with us for a long time, even decades. And you know, when we respond on a day-to-day basis, rather than having long-range plans and invest in, be willing to take courageous stands, and sometimes they may be unpopular, but in the long term, they'll be very popular because they will bring about success.
Well, you know, it's been a wonderful discussion. We're almost at our 1 hour mark, and Mohammed, I think you gave us a great horizon. If we can build the Abraham Accords and strengthen the ties between Israel and all of her Arab neighbors in the region, and even the Persians, maybe they'll join as well. Wouldn't that be the day? So we'll all think about that joyous potential end note and future as we think about the last year of the Abraham Accords and all of the potential opportunities that are there to strengthen the lives of people and countries and governments and regions. So again, thank you, gentlemen, for this discussion today. I'm very, very grateful.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you for convening us.